And joining us next will be Kara Fornstrom, who's the chairman of the Wyoming Public Service Commission. She was first nominated by Governor Meade in 2013, and was just renominated and reappointed by the Senate for her second term last month with the legislative session. She's a Wyoming native and been very involved with NARUC, which is the sort of the association of those state regulators. Before that, an attorney working on a lot of natural resources and energy issues. But she has really been kind of one of the preeminent thought leaders from a regulated utility and regulator perspective on sort of carbon management and understanding kind of those gaps, between policy, where we are and where we need to be, and kind of thinking through that. So pleased to have Kara join us today and kind of share some thoughts on carbon management from a regulator perspective. So Kara, thank you.
Try something new today. I'm going to try to do my, this probably seems silly to a lot of you, but I'm going to try to do my PowerPoint off my laptop with my note sheets. I've always preferred to have them all printed out so that I can read them and change this sheet, but I have a couple of young staffers at the PSC who help me with my speeches, and they've convinced me that it's time to take the next step. So we'll see if I can run this and run that at the same time. Thank you. Great. Thank you, Jason, for the introduction. I want to tell you just a little bit more about me as I get started and why I'm interested in these topics. But first, I want to thank Sarah and Jason and the team and all the work they do at these conferences. Right now, I'm serving as president of Western Conference of the Public Service Commissions, and Wyoming will be hosting that conference in Cheyenne on June 2nd through the 5th for any of you who might be interested in learning more about utility issues. And it's been really nice to have control of the agenda for once. I can decide what it is we're going to talk about. But it is daunting to try to fill that many slots. So I did want to plug that Jason will be speaking at that conference on Monday in one of our opening sessions about the future of carbon capture. So we're grateful that he agreed to do that. We're excited to host the conference. As Jason said, I've been very active in NARUC since I went on the commission. And one of my roles in NARUC has been to serve as vice chairman of the Clean Coal and Carbon Management Subcommittee. As part of that, we meet separately at all of our annual conferences, which are 3 times a year. In addition, we do 2 site visits a year. And we were very proud to host the subcommittee in Gillette last September. We have some Gillette folks here that helped us out with that. We had a really good turnout of commissioners, some from Illinois, Florida, and it just, as you know, any of you who brought people there, just gives them a very different perspective about what coal country looks like. We had a wonderful trip, really opened some eyes and got some new perspectives, so that was great. As my work in the Clean Coal Subcommittee has progressed, I find myself as one of the few utility commissioners around the country who's willing to go talk about coal. And obviously being from Wyoming, it's a natural fit for me. I think this may be one of my least hostile audiences I've ever had to go talk to, though, which I appreciate. Sometimes it's a pretty tough sell. I think the toughest one I've done so far was Santa Fe last summer. Nobody really wanted to hear about what I had to say, but I said it anyway. So obviously the overlap with what I do as my day job as a commissioner, and we're seeing more and more of this overlap as we talk about things. And that's really what I want to focus on today, is how we bridge the gap for utilities, regulated utilities, who control a great amount of the CO2 in this country, how we get them incentivized to participate in carbon capture projects. I also just wanted to note the subcommittee will be touring facilities in Alabama in May, so I'm looking forward to that. And then in a couple weeks, I've been asked to be part of a state federal delegation to the UK for a carbon capture tour. We have some meetings in London the first day, and then we go over to Scotland for a CCUS conference, and we're going to tour some facilities there. So I hope to learn a lot there and bring that back. And then before I just want to make my disclaimers. Anything I say today is not the position of the Public Service Commission. It is not meant to prejudge any application that may come before us, and I'm certainly not speaking on behalf of the state of Wyoming. So, today's presentation, oh, see, I've got to do both, okay. Why the future of coal matters to Wyoming, the pressures of coal-fired electricity, that Wyoming's response has really been to lead in a variety of areas. What's impeding utilities from investing in CCUS technology? We're going to do a short course on Ratemaking 101, talk quite a bit about the Wyoming legislative policy that came out of the 2019 session, and then really pose the question for you to consider, is regulatory innovation the missing piece? And Jason set this up great because he talked about all the pieces that Wyoming has, and today I want to talk about whether regulatory innovation is that last piece. A lot of my presentation I'm going to go through fairly quickly. Between Dr. Godby yesterday and Jason's presentation just before me, and Kim Coddington's after me, they are all greater experts in a lot of this, and so I'm going to defer to their presentations, but wasn't quite sure what everyone was going to say, so I've included it. Why the future of coal matters to Wyoming, talk quickly about our location of coal mines, where our coal-fired generation plants are, and our portion of the U.S. economy. This is a map I'm sure most of you have seen. Wyoming is home to 1.4 trillion tons of coal resources. The seams in the Powder River Basin range from 5 feet to 200 feet, and recent estimates indicate that Wyoming has more than 165 billion tons of recoverable coal. This gives you just a quick graph of the highest producing coal mines in Wyoming. Actually, this is in the country, and you can see where Wyoming rates up there with our mines. And this is top 10 coal producing mines in 2017. The top 3 coal mines in the U.S. have a combined production of approximately 34 million short tons. This is 2017 coal production by state. As we've talked about a lot this conference, Wyoming produces 40% of the coal in this country, which is more than the next 6 states combined: West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Kentucky, Texas, and Montana. This gives you an idea of where our coal-fired plants are around the state. Dave Johnston has 4 units, Jim Bridger 4 units, Naughton 3 units, Wyodak 1, Laramie River Station 3, and Dry Fork 1. This is a graph just to illustrate what coal revenues do for the state of Wyoming. Estimated for the 2017, which is based on 2016 production, is $891 million. This is made up of different pie pieces: the federal mineral royalties, severance taxes, federal mineral bonus payments, and ad valorem production. It is important to note, and I know all of you from Wyoming know this, but because we've been talking about it so much, the last federal coal lease was awarded in 2010, and the final coal bonus bid was paid in 2017, and that has been the source of school building funds for the state of Wyoming. So we are trying to figure out where to go from here. I knew this was going to be too much for me, trying to do both of these things. I think I hit the bottom button. Thank you. Sarah's a genius. Dr. Godby had a different kind of map yesterday, but this shows you how many power plants in the country are fueled by Powder River Basin coal. Oops. And these numbers are from Dr. Godby's 2012 report. Very similar to what he talked about yesterday in terms of the concepts of direct employment, indirect, and induced. I understand these numbers are being updated, but this just gives you an idea of the total impact of coal-related jobs in Wyoming from generation, railroad, and coal mining. And this is just a graph, similar colors, blue for direct, orange for indirect, and gray for induced. The coal economy addition to gross state product in 2012. Anticipate those numbers will look different when he updates them this fall, but it just gives you an idea of how big those numbers are. I think we're all pretty familiar with the pressures on coal-fired generation, natural gas, national energy policies, and legal rulings, and state energy policy. And then we'll just quickly talk about what those impacts have been. Everyone in the room is familiar with the natural gas phenomenon in the United States with the fracking boom. This chart is pretty phenomenal when you look at what we've done for natural gas production in this country in the last 10 years. Given the volumes and the quantity of natural gas, prices have remained low, which make it a viable alternative for generation, electric generation. We've also had national energy policies such as PURPA. Under PURPA, which was enacted in 1978, electric utilities are required to purchase energy offered by qualified facilities at rates that are just and reasonable to consumers and reflect no greater than the incremental cost that utility would have otherwise incurred to generate or purchase that power, known as the avoided cost. PURPA really rests on two pillars. One, that there will be no discrimination towards qualifying facilities, and that the customers will be held indifferent to that power coming on. It wouldn't be any more expensive than what the utilities would do otherwise. As you can imagine, trying to set that avoided cost is a pretty tricky thing to do. There's a lot of pressure now to replace or repeal PURPA on the national level. FERC has an open docket looking at that. There are major issues about that, including whether there should be competitive solicitations to try to determine what that avoided cost is. Some commissions do that, Colorado, for example. The long-term nature of the contracts. Most of the contracts under PURPA are about 20 years, and whether that really does hold ratepayers indifferent as the prices come down. And then we have just sort of a piecemeal function of what's going on with PURPA around the country. Different states are doing different things. For example, Idaho has recently reduced their PURPA contract to a 3-year with a review period. And so, and Wyoming actually has a pending application to look at some of these issues as well. And I just wanted to plug Western Conference again. We are going to be having a PURPA debate as part of our agenda on Monday from 2 to 3. Travis Kabula, who's a well-known former Montana commissioner, will be debating Professor Carl Rabigo from Pace Law School. So we're looking forward to that classic debate style agenda item. National energy policies have also affected coal. We have the ITCs and the PTCs supporting and subsidizing construction of wind facilities and solar facilities. Those tax credits are gradually coming down. We've seen quite a bit of pressure at the Commission to approve projects in the last year so that they can qualify for the full funding. The project that Chad Tupley talked about yesterday, EV 2020, those wind projects, it was a very big part of the case that they get those approved in time to get full qualification. Otherwise, the economics of the project were much different and would have had a different kind of hearing, I think, at the Commission. We're also seeing it in the forms of complaints filed against mostly Rocky Mountain Power that come to us from these QFs, questioning whether the avoided cost has been set correctly, and they want the Commission to engage in that and try to deal with those contracts. Some people say that PURPA has been wildly successful in getting wind and solar resources built in this country. Wind grew 80% between 2008 and 2018, accounted for 6.5% of 2018 generation. Solar grew from 2 to 96 megawatts during the same time period, representing 2.3% of generation in 2018. I'm going to let Kip talk about this more in his presentation, but this case in 2007 really set up the endangerment finding for the EPA to regulate greenhouse gases, which has put additional pressure on the coal industry. State energy policy has had a great effect on the coal industry as well. This map shows state energy policy in different states. The green states have renewable portfolio standards. The light green states, they have some sort of energy, I can't quite read that, some sort of standard. And then the gray states, which of course Wyoming is one, have no RPS. These concepts really started building in California about 1995, but the first one was enacted in California in 2002. The new rate is 100% clean or renewable electricity targets. And this is a very recent map. Yellow indicates that legislation is anticipated on 100% renewable standard. Blue is that the legislation is studying it. The green stripe states are ones where the governor supports such a standard. The light green shows where legislation has been introduced. The dark green shows where legislation has been enacted. And this map is very hard to keep up with. I think just in the last week we could add Colorado probably to the yellow column. And other states, it does seem like every week we're getting another announcement about states moving to clean or renewable electricity targets. I would note that we have seen some, in my view, progress on this front. For example, Oregon's earlier law talks about no coal in utility rates after 2030. California and some of the other states that we're seeing move towards these sort of standards are talking about carbon neutral. And California has specifically then left the door open that carbon capture is a technology that would meet those standards. This is a map that shows where Wyoming shipped coal to in 2015. 91% of the coal produced in Wyoming was shipped to 29 other states in 2015. And then you'll notice that Utah, Idaho, Oregon, Washington are kind of blank there. And I just want to note that even though they don't receive coal shipments, we export coal-fired electricity generated in Wyoming to those states. So when you look at this map, especially in 2015, you can see that Wyoming was really affecting almost every state in the country. This is the map in 2016 that has fallen to 27 states, and I think Dr. Godby presented some more current information yesterday that I'll use to update this as well. So just between 2015 and 2016, New York and Florida stopped receiving any Wyoming coal, and we had some pretty big reductions in Texas, Missouri, and Illinois. And again, Dr. Godby talked about that yesterday, about the impacts of that. These are just graphs to show you, I think, what we all know, what the impact of all these policies and natural gas and all those things have happened and what the effect has been on Wyoming coal production. That's just another graph showing the same thing. And then here's the jobs, the effect on jobs. And I think the Casper Star just released this week that Wyoming lost 153 coal mining jobs last year. This map is pretty startling, I think. What was unusual for Wyoming, even as a boom and bust economy in 2016, is that everything kind of tanked at the same time. Oil, coal. In this map, the orange is crude oil, dark blue is natural gas, black is coal, the light blue is trona, and the green is other. The red is the total, and for those of us who lived through the 2015, 2016, we're still trying to recover, I think, from that big drop, but this graph really illustrates what that did to the state of Wyoming's economy. So what's Wyoming's response been? In my view, it's been to lead. We're leading in the legal framework, both on the state and federal level. We're leading on technology with the carbon capture integrated test center, things that are going on at the University of Wyoming. We're leading in CO2 pipeline corridor infrastructure. Wyoming is certainly far ahead on that. And my question for all of you today, and the thought I want to leave you with, is are we now positioned to lead from a regulatory perspective? This, again, I'm going to leave to talk more about, but the Wyoming legislature really was a leader nationally in 2012 in setting up the framework about how carbon could be sequestered and ownership issues and all of those things. We've seen on the federal side, Senator Barrasso leading both with the Futures Act and the Use It Act. We've talked about the significance of 45Q and how that went, how much that helped by increasing the amounts, extending the deadlines for that. And I think one of the more significant things that the Futures Act did is it made the tax credit transferable, which for groups like REAs who have no tax liability maybe incentivizes them a little bit more because that didn't really mean anything to them. But now they can now transfer that tax credit to a partner who has tax liability. This is a pretty basic diagram about how we're leading in technology in terms of how electricity generation works with CCUS. This is an interesting slide that's showing all the different utilization components for captured CO2. It does include EOR, which we talked about as the only proven technology at this point for CO2, but others are showing a lot of promise: plastics, chemicals, fuels. Some of these are being tested at the ITC. I won't go over this slide since Jason covered it in depth in his, but a lot of exciting things going on at the ITC. We're not the only state where different things are going on. I wanted to just give you an idea of different carbon capture projects across the country. A couple things going on in this map. There's a color code. Green is bioenergy with carbon capture, blue is carbon use, yellow is direct air capture, red is industrial, purple is power generation. You'll notice probably most known there is Petronova. And then the orange is test center, which obviously the ITC has shown, the National Carbon Capture Center in Alabama, and the University of Kentucky's site as well. In addition, there are different symbols. If it's a cross, it means the project is in planning. Diamond means it's under construction. The solid circle shows it's in operation, and the empty circle shows that it's completed. So you look across across the map and you see a lot of different things going on across the country. I also sense a national movement with carbon capture. On the screen are just a few of the different initiatives that are going on around the country. You'll see ITC there, and ClearPath, different groups like that. Carbon 180 is on there. A lot of these have been founded recently and are making great strides. Wyoming is also leading on CO2 pipeline corridor infrastructure. This is a map that shows where the pipelines are. It also shows the bigger the circle is, the bigger the CO2 source is. And then you'll see the little diamonds are potential EOR targets. And so that pipeline comes close to a lot of those, and Wyoming is really leading on getting CO2 to the places where it can be used. So is regulatory innovation the missing piece? The real question is, what's impeding utilities, regulated utilities, from investing in carbon capture technology? I believe it boils down to a couple of things. One, the risk tolerance. Two, incentives, and probably the traditional rate-making model. I don't want anything I'm about to say to be perceived as any sort of criticism against utilities. I'm actually a big fan of utilities. I think the state of Wyoming is greatly blessed to be served by sophisticated electrical utilities. And I think we need no further evidence than the storm we lived through a couple of weeks ago, which was really brutal. And we came through that with very little disruption. I was talking to utilities, they had teams ready to go, and that's the other great thing about them. They have to go out and work in the worst conditions possible. And a lot of times they were just waiting. They didn't have any calls at all. And so that really speaks well to the system that we have in Wyoming, and that's very important in terms of reliability. So this graph shows risk profile by industry, and it's using beta to determine that. And beta is the measure of a stock's volatility in relation to the market. By definition, the market has a beta of 1, and individual stocks are ranked according to how much they deviate from the market. Low beta means low volatility. Beta is often used as a proxy for risk, and I hope you can see that on the far right, that last bar represents utilities beta. It's about 0.25 compared to the regular market of 1. And I assure you, if utility regulators had a beta, we'd be even lower than that. So why is the utility risk so much lower? Mostly because of the fact that they're regulated and they have to come to the commission to get things into rate base. And we have to protect ratepayers from potentially risky investments. I'd also then like you to compare to oil and gas producers' beta, which is about the 6th bar from the right side. It's almost 1.5. So when we talk about utilities and potentially E&P companies coming together for a carbon capture project for EOR, I can imagine the conversation goes something like this, given their betas. The E&P company goes to the utility and says, "I've got this great project, it's going to be awesome. There's recoverable assets, we can do this, it won't take much, it's right there." And the utility says, "Whoa, that sounds really risky. That's not what we do. It's outside of our thing. We don't know if our regulators would like that." And the E&P company says, "No, really, it's great. I promise, we're going to make money. It's going to be great." And they say, "Oh, we're already making money. We're good. We don't need to go down that road." So I think utility risk and the difference between the risk profiles of the project developers and the utilities that control the CO2 is a real mismatch and something that we have to recognize. You also have to recognize that this is really how the power sector is regulated. They have environmental regulation, they have reliability regulation through NERC, and they have economic regulation through their commissions. We're going to talk a little bit about traditional rate-making model, the regulatory compact, how it, that we have to protect the public interest, assets are determined to come into rate base, that they're used and useful, and that they have to provide safe and reliable service. So why isn't CCES typically included in rate base at this point? Lab to date of commercial success. They can't really point to any project to a regulator and say, "This is proven technology, it will be fine, we're not exposing our customers to any risk, and this project is not successful." We'll talk briefly about Ratemaking 101. I don't want to go too far into this, but I think it's important to understand how utilities make their money and why CCUS projects may not currently fit into the traditional model. So what is rate base? We're going to start simple formula. Rate base equals gross plant and service minus accumulated depreciation plus working capital plus materials and supplies plus customer contributed capital plus deferred income tax. It's just so easy. It's just a very simple thing to do. Stated another way, rate base is the value of facilities and other investments used to provide service to customers upon which the utility is allowed an opportunity to earn a fair rate of return. How is rate base used? It's really used to determine what the revenue requirement is, and that's the annual revenues required by a utility to cover both its expenses and have the opportunity to earn its rate of return, which is determined by the commission. The rate of return really is sort of the art and science mix of rate making. The rate of return is a result of the weighted cost of capital calculations between the cost of debt and the cost of equity. The cost of debt is fairly easy to figure out. We know what utilities are borrowing money at. But the rate of the return on equity is something that the commission sets. And if we have a rate case, we may have 4 parties telling us what we should find on ROE. And they do vary based on where the interest rates are. We do try to keep companies as close to a 50-50 capital mix as we can. Sometimes we have to impute ROE because companies are 100% debt financed, for example. Sometimes we have to impute cost of debt because they're 100% equity owned, and we don't want that either. And so the important part of this formula that you need to see is that the R, which is the overall rate of return, is multiplied by the rate base. So it stands to reason that the bigger the rate base, the more opportunity the utility has to earn. So they want to put things into rate base. They want to invest. That's traditionally how they've been incentivized to invest in projects. And unfortunately, at this point, in terms of where we are with technology, carbon capture doesn't fit into rate base. The other difficulty, I think, with trying to get carbon capture projects off the ground with utilities is just the regulatory process itself. It takes a long time. The case gets prepared, then there's a filing, then a review, we have hearings, we have interveners. Typically after hearing, we take some time before we come and deliberate and actually make the decision, and then we issue the order and new rates become effective. We had some strong direction this year from the Wyoming legislature on these issues that I wanted to explore a little bit in more depth, both related to Senate File 159 and House Bill 113, that I believe provides some policy direction for the commission and perhaps for utilities to be more incentivized to get involved in carbon capture projects. We're lucky to have one of the sponsors of Senate File 159, Senator Baxter, with us, and so he'll correct me if I get any of this wrong, but this is how I'm reading it. Senate File 159 created 2 new statutory sections in Title 37, which is really the PSC title. It's important to note at the start that REAs are exempted from this. 37.2.133 does a couple of different things. Utilities are obligated to purchase electricity generated by a coal-fired generation facility by agreement that is approved by the commission. We then sell that electricity will be sold at the avoided cost as determined by the commission. And that determination can be made prior, and probably should be made prior to the agreement being finalized, so that purchaser of the coal plant knows exactly what it is they're going to be getting for their electricity. But really what the legislature did here is incorporated the perfect concept of must-take. So there was a must-take obligation of electricity produced at a predetermined price set by the commission, which is something that, as I mentioned, we do all the time. The other thing, they did put in a definition of avoided cost for us, because avoided cost can mean different things in different contexts. For purposes of Senate File 159, avoided cost means incremental cost to an electric utility of electric energy or capacity or both, but for the purpose from the otherwise retiring facility, the utility would generate itself or incur in a purchase from another source. Pretty similar to the perfect definition. But it would be interesting to see what data would be submitted to try to determine that. The second section that is new is 37.3.116. And, sorry, that's not right. I have the statute here just in case I need to refer to it. Maybe there's just one, I'm sorry. But it also limits cost recovery after January 1st, 2022 of units that have been retired, unless the commission determines that the utility has made a good faith effort to negotiate, try to sell that facility prior to retirement, and that they did not refuse a reasonable offer to purchase. The statute provides the commission direction on what good faith means, such as the utility provided sufficient prior notice to retirement, reasonable efforts to make potential purchasers aware of the opportunity to purchase the facility, whether the utility reasonably evaluated any offers received, and any other factor deemed appropriate by the commission. It also helps us determine what a reasonable offer to purchase is. It would have reduced cost, it would reduce environmental risk, etc. And it also gives the commission some guidelines on what they have to do in evaluating purchasers, not unlike existing statute jurisdiction on how we look at new owners. It did add a new twist. We always evaluate when someone's purchasing an asset from the utility, whether they have the financial, managerial, and ability to actually run and operate a utility. This statute also says we must look at whether they have the ability to manage the environmental risk associated with taking on a coal-fired plant. So there's a lot of detail in Senate File 159. A lot of things have come to the commission in terms of how we will look at these agreements should they come. And the purchase, importantly, the purchase can only be effective after the commission approves the agreement. The other bill that was significant that I just want to talk about from a conceptual standpoint is House Bill 113. And this was really pushed by Black Hills Energy to address some of the blockchain customers that they're seeing. But it follows a model that the commission has already approved to serve Microsoft. So the issue becomes you have a customer that may have a volatile and potentially transient load, but there's generation resources needed to serve that new load because the utility can't do it with existing sources. Similar to the conversation we had earlier about putting those generation resources into rate base, which is the current model for utilities to do, the commission said we don't feel comfortable, and I think the utility recognized this as well, putting new generation to serve Microsoft into rates because Microsoft might leave tomorrow. And that would leave customers with this excess generation that they didn't need, and they'll be paying for it forever. So the situation that we did prior to House Bill 113 was a little bit different in that we knew a lot about Microsoft. We knew about their load characteristics, we knew what their load was, they've been growing for some time, and we were able to craft a solution that made, I think, even the interveners happy in that. The class that Microsoft fits into is called the ICS class, and there are only two other customers in that class, Holly Frontier and Dyno Nobel, big industrial users. And so we said to those users, we will guarantee, or the utility did, we'll put 35 megawatts of use into that customer class, which at the next rate case, or at that rate case, helped spread those fixed costs over another user, which takes some rate pressure off of those two industrial users. But then for anything over 35 megawatts, we approved a tariff, I think it's called the LCGS. Dave can correct me. And what it says is, it really is sort of the concept of 113. It says, we're not going to let you put generation to serve load above 35 into rates. So you, utility, go do what you need to do to serve this customer. And because we're not going to let you put it in rate base, you're not going to get an opportunity to get a return on that rate base, we're going to let you create a separate revenue stream. And that will not be included in the calculations of ROE. So it really was the first time that our commission, and I don't know how many commissions around the country have looked at this, but we've set aside the traditional rate-making model and said, and allowed utilities to have a separate revenue stream that we don't investigate that doesn't become part of ROE. So 113 really built on that concept. It really is sort of to expand and get a formal policy nod from the legislature that creating these separate revenue streams and these special contracts for customers is acceptable. And what 113 does is it sets out really for blockchain. So we're kind of coming at it from the other end. We're prepared for this new class of users instead of how we dealt with Microsoft, which was a little bit at a time. And I can't talk too much about where we are with the blockchain tariff because Black Hills has a pending tariff application at the commission to approve that tariff. I understand the parties in that case have reached a settlement, and we will hear that case on April 30th and see what the tariff looks like as a result of 113. But I think the important point about 113 for utilities, I think it introduces the concept that may work for carbon capture projects as well. I think it can say to utilities would obviously perhaps need some additional legislation, because this talks about serving customers with greater load than 5 megawatts. And this wouldn't be necessarily serving load. But the concept of allowing utilities to generate revenue separate from rate base, I think is a significant concept to consider when you're looking at carbon capture projects, given the state of technology today, that they wouldn't be included in rate base. So what could the utilities do to make revenue if they're not going to be in rate base? I think we got some clear direction from the legislature this year. Obviously their preference is to delay closures of coal plants. They're encouraging utilities to find purchasers of either units or plants. They included a must-take obligation, which is an interesting thing to do, and they left it to the commission to make a lot of determinations with some sideboards that they provided for us on good faith, reasonableness, and the ability of purchasers to handle these kinds of obligations. They also included some cost recovery implications for retiring plants, replacement generation, and they expanded the commission's innovative rate-making jurisdiction to talk about utilities earning revenue streams outside of traditional rate base. Also in 113, a very important concept is to protect existing customers. I think an amendment that came in the Senate on 113 requires the commission to review these agreements once every 3 years to ensure that our customers are not being negatively affected by these special agreements. So, is regulatory innovation the missing piece to getting carbon capture projects at a major utility facility in Wyoming? We've talked a lot about CO2 as a revenue stream. So if carbon capture infrastructure is not at the stage to be approved for inclusion in rate base, how do we incentivize utilities to make CO2 available for carbon capture projects? As I think about this, and I've thought about this for a number of years, really it seems to me that CO2 is a commodity, very similar to how we regulate natural gas. It's a commodity. The states, as natural gas has increased in use, have decoupled the commodity price from the rates. And so we have what we call pass-on applications to just deal with the natural gas piece. No return is earned on that commodity piece. Some companies come in once a month to modify their commodity price for natural gas. Some come in quarterly, semi-annually, annually. And those always include a true-up calculation from the balancing account to see what their projection was versus what actually happened, because it's based on volumetric units of how much gas they intended or they predict that they're going to sell. So perhaps CO2 could be treated similarly as a commodity. The difference here is, based on, let's just use the EOR project as an example, as I understand it, those contracts are indexed, so the CO2 would have different values at different times. So could the utility come in every 6 months, for example, and adjust its CO2 pass-on? Again, this would be a credit, though, instead of a charge to customers, because the CO2 is revenue to the utility. And so we could simplify the rate-making process by treating it as a commodity, as a pass-on. It would benefit customers by reducing rates as a credit that would vary based on what the utility was selling the CO2 for. And that all sounds fine and fairly simple from a regulatory aspect. We process these applications fairly quickly and get that money back to customers. But what's in it for the utility? Probably to make this attractive to utilities, we would have to consider some sort of sharing band. We'd have to invoke the concept of House Bill 113 and say to the utilities, we're going to let you keep part of what you sell your CO2 for. Otherwise, there's no incentive financially for the utilities to participate with these projects. I don't want to prejudge what those sharing bands could be or whether sharing bands is how a utility might want to proceed. But I am confident that if utilities start thinking differently about how they could be compensated, how they could earn, how they could provide returns to their shareholders, they could come up with some really creative things and some creative proposals about how we might go about making sure that utilities understand that there's something in it for them on these projects. The ultimate question that will come down for our commission and any commission where this is presented is the public interest served by allowing these projects to go forward in this manner. And I have argued in the past that public interest in Wyoming may be something different given what we're facing. Dr. Godby's presentation yesterday, I think, informs what the public interest is for determination of Wyoming. It may be a broader standard than we've looked at historically, but certainly all those impacts, I think, are part of the public interest determination and may influence how a commission would look at a proposed CCUS project and how the utility may choose to earn its revenue. So, I think we all know that the future of coal matters to Wyoming, and I hope I've convinced you that the traditional rate-making model may not provide sufficient incentives for regulated utilities to involve themselves in CCUS projects. Wyoming legislative policy seems to be opening the door to innovative rate-making solutions, not just for transient customers, but for these kinds of projects that are not yet commercial enough to put into rate base. So is regulatory innovation the missing piece for Wyoming to be the place where this project happens first? And can Wyoming continue to lead, as we have in all those other areas, technology, legal framework? Can we lead on the regulatory front to help other states and other utilities who may be interested in pursuing this technology that just don't see a profit to pursue it? That's all I have for you. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. My contact information is on the screen. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me offline directly. I'd love to talk about any of this with anyone, so please reach out.
Send it on later.
So, Kara, would you need legislation to allow that sharing, or is there something in statute that would already allow that?
That's a great question, Senator. Thank you. We allow sharing bands now for things like the net power cost adjustment that utilities come in. We want to incentivize them to keep their costs low. So, for example, there's a net power cost in existing rates, and then they come in every year and we judge what's in rates versus what they actually spent. And the incentive there is, if you're below what's in rates, we're going to let you keep part of that credit. Different utilities have different sharing bands on that kind of adjustment, but my view is that we do it now, and so I assume we have the statutory authority to provide something in the sharing band that really does enter into that public interest standard and what we think is appropriate in terms of what goes to customers and what goes to shareholders.
Any other questions?
I'm curious about the apparent sort of catch-22 here, that you can't rate base CCUS because it's not commercially proven, but nobody seems to be willing to do the first thing. It seems like Wyoming, given its leadership position in coal, would be a great place and a self-interested place to do so. How do you see that apparent conflict resolving itself, or am I mischaracterizing it?
No, I think that's exactly right, and I think that's really the bottom line of my presentation is we have to allow utilities to get out of the traditional thought about how they earn. They only earn on rate base. If we're going to take that away from them, we have to give them the freedom and the ability, and I think the legislature is putting the framework in place to say, we're willing to consider other ideas. And so my idea on the pass on and a sharing band is potentially one way to incentivize utilities to do it. At least there's something in it for them. I don't know what those numbers look like and whether it's enough to get them interested in it. But like I said, I'm confident that if they spent some time thinking about this, they might come up with all kinds of opportunities or thoughts about how they would like to be compensated, how to deal with their risk factor. And I think there's a lot in it for a utility to be the first one to do this. They can be out there on the national stage. Look, we are carbon neutral at this coal plant in Wyoming. We've found a way for it to work for customers. We've found a way for it to make for shareholders. And if we get some commercial projects going, it will get them back to, probably, rate basing a significant investment into rate base. Because those projects are always going to be pretty expensive, have a pretty good price tag. Once we get some successes, maybe we go back to the traditional model. Maybe this is a bridge to get them there. But I think there are bragging rights involved. But we have to find a financial incentive for them to do it, and I think the legislature is helping us come up with some of those concepts, and I'm encouraging utilities to put some of their best minds to this issue and see what they come up with, because I'm confident they will be able to do so if we demonstrate that we're open to those kinds of options.
right, any other questions?
Kip, I was expecting a three-part question from you. I'm disappointed. Thank you all very much for your attention. We make
For the next speaker, please feel free to grab another cup of coffee or use the restroom. I think there's still some